Hey everyone, welcome to our STEAM Passport virtual field trip series. My name is Ashley Lynn and I'm the founder of Project Exchange, which is bringing you these field trips today. Our mission is to help every student access a meaningful cross-cultural learning experience as part of their education. And so leading our field trip today is Emily, who is a Master of Science student studying environmental engineering at the University of Alberta. And so she'll be sharing her story about how culture, gender, and community identity has shaped her STEAM journey. So Emily, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be moving into a presentation here in a second, but first I just wanted to start with a quick view of myself and of one of the labs I work in. So you can just see a little bit, this is a medical research laboratory. I am an engineering student, but I also work a lot in interdisciplinary sex, so I also work with medicine a lot. So now to get on into my presentation. So like Ashley said, my name's Emily Quecke, and I'm a Master's of Science student in Environmental Engineering, being co-supervised out of Preventative Medicine. And today I want to talk about doing your part and using your unique gifts for positive change. This is kind of a theme that has gone through in my journey so far in STEAM, and something that I'm very passionate about, and I think I can really talk to in a lot of my personal experience. So just a quick overview. I'm going to first talk a little bit about myself and about my research. Then I'm going to get into why did I choose environmental engineering and kind of go through my journey in engineering as a whole. Then I'm going to talk about some of more of my experiences in kind of community-driven solutions and using diversity to better attack problems. And then a little bit of a conclusion, and we'll do your questions. So about myself, I've kind of organized this into kind of past, present, and future, and then some fun facts. So I am already an environmental engineer. I did my undergraduate in environmental engineering here at the University of Alberta. And for those of you who don't know, the University of Alberta is in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So kind of right above Montana. Edmonton is one of the most northern large populous cities, so it does get very cold, and I've grown up here and just continued my university journey here because we do have a very great engineering program in general, but specifically environmental engineering. So while I was doing my undergraduate degree, I also did what's called a co-op degree. So I had work terms where I was paid to work as an engineer and to start putting what I was learning into practice. And a couple of those co-op work terms were very formative, and I'll speak to them a little bit later. But the co-op program was a fantastic option for me because it did let me kind of explore what an engineer does in the real world and kind of bring that back into my studies. I was also, in the past, when I was working on my undergraduate degree, the vice president of my local student society, so the Civil and Environmental Engineering Student Society. That's something I just wanted to mention because for those of you who are interested in going to university, I highly recommend getting involved. Being the vice president academic actually is what led me to my graduate career because I was able to work hand in hand with a couple of professors, and one of them ended up being my supervisor. So it is something I highly recommend. So now what I'm doing at this moment. So like I said, master's degree in environmental engineering, but I am collaborating with preventative medicine because environmental engineering has a lot to do with exposure and risk from pollution. And that kind of exposure risk starts to meld into medicine because you're looking at the pollutants and exposure, what they actually do to your body and how concerning they are. And there is metabolites and early markers. So those two do end up starting to kind of meld when you get to the exposure side. And with my degree, I'm specifically looking at welding fume research. And also at the moment, I'm doing a lot of fun outreach things. I'm challenge manager for a local science Olympic event and things like that. What am I going to do next? I am thinking about maybe doing either my PhD and or after that doing some consulting engineering, which I'll touch on a little bit later and what that is. And ultimately, someday, I would like to be a professor. There's not a lot of female professors in engineering nowadays, but you're starting to see more and more. And I just think, especially at that high level of research and teaching, it's very important to have that diversity. And I would really like to be that, cool female professor that young women coming into engineering can look up to. So that's kind of what I have on my personal docket. And some fun facts about myself: I have 3 cats. I'm a little bit of a crazy cat lady. I play roller derby, so I do a lot of sports and a lot of working out for that, and I travel all over for roller derby. And I also love to read, which has been very helpful in academia because aside from this cool lab that I showed you behind me, most of what I do is writing and reading, so doing academic papers and literature reviews. So loving to read in my personal time has definitely helped with my degree. So moving on a little bit to my research in my area, so air quality engineering. So first of all, I just want to kind of get you thinking, what do these following images have in common? So from afar, there's some very different images on here that don't necessarily seem related, but what they all have in common is they all present pollution and exposure scenarios to impacted or negatively impacted air quality. So some of them are very straightforward. You see the person working with welding fumes, they're creating all these gaseous metals and fumes that are potentially harmful to breathe in. There's also, as we see, an industrial stack that has a plume coming out. Again, very obvious man-made chemicals that are going to impact air quality. And same with the big smog event in the bottom left corner. But then there's some that you don't really think about as much. Cooking, baking are 2 of the potentially most dangerous things a person will do with their day. And a lot of people don't realize that because they are creating particulates in the air and volatiles, and especially if you're cooking over any sort of open flame or gas, that is creating more particulates and bad things in the air that are going to affect the air quality and potentially affect human health, but also other elements. So when we're looking at exposure and pollution, we're not looking at just solely human health. There are secondary effects that we're trying to mitigate. For example, in the bottom left corner with that smog, say you were going for a nice day in the mountains, you're not going to be able to see any of the beautiful vistas, and that is going to negatively impact quality of life and enjoyment of natural things. So that is something that we're also trying to mitigate when we're looking at air quality. Another one of the pictures shown here is forest fires. Forest fires, again, is not really something that we typically think of as being a pollutant type activity, because normally we think of things that are human driven. While forest fires, though often natural and important, they create a lot of smoke and particulate matter that can cause very severe human health events because of this negatively impact air quality. So again, just that kind of images of kind of the why we have to look into this, because things that can impact our air quality are all around us. So air quality engineering in general is kind of organized into 2 groups. So there's kind of characterization and control. I personally work more on the characterization side. So what that means is looking at what's in the air and in what quantities and where it's coming from, because in order to understand if there's any point actually in even trying to remediate it, or if it's actually posing any real threat, you need to understand it first and foremost. So I have some pictures on this slide here of some of the equipment I use. The 2 blue devices in the top left corner of the characterization side, I actually have used for a lot of my research. And so that's the characterization side. And then there's the control side. So that's when we start using our knowledge of what's out there and how harmful they are to make different devices and engineer different systems to mitigate the potential negative effects like I had spoke to in the last slide. And so my research specifically is with welding fumes. So welding fumes present a occupational exposure scenario that's very heightened because you're leaning right over, you're there for long periods of time, and it's every day for potentially years if this is something you're doing as a career. So there's just a heightened exposure scenario. So we want to make sure people aren't getting sick from their work or being injured from their work. And especially with fumes and air quality things, they're a little bit more invisible. You don't really necessarily think of them always. So with these invisible threats, it's something that still, even to this day, hasn't really been fleshed out. Yes, there are masks and ventilations, but sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes we don't even know if that's enough. So that's where I'm at. I'm developing emission factors. So emission factors are a quantitative metric that basically looks at how much output pollution there is based on how much input work activity. So when you have that number, you can plan. You know how much fume is going to be created and how dangerous that specific fume is. So when you know that, you can be sure that whatever safety measures you put in are doing their job. So that's what I'm working on. And to do this, I need a special conical chamber that's pictured here on this slide. Right now, we're in the process of having one fabricated for us. So once we have the chamber, we can continue with the experiments and then analyze them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental engineering as a whole and as a profession, and specifically my journey to finding environmental engineering and how I became so passionate about it. So in environmental engineering, here we can kind of see I have a bit of a chart that shows where it fits in the broader spectrum of engineering. So engineering itself is an applied science. So using all the calculus and science background that you get, especially in your first couple of years in engineering, and then creating a solution that fits into the real world and into the problem. It's really problem solving, which is why I love it. So within engineering, there's a couple of major disciplines, one of which is civil engineering. And within civil engineering, there's also, again, a couple of specific kind of areas that people can specialize in, and one of them being environmental engineering. So here we have a definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So the development of environmental engineering is the development of processes and infrastructure for the supply of water, the disposal of waste, and the control of pollution of all kinds. These endeavors protect public health by preventing disease transmission, and they preserve the quality of the environment by averting the contamination and degradation of air, water, and land resources. So as you can see, environmental engineering in itself is quite broad, and it can impact all aspects of your everyday life, from drinking the water from your tap to just walking around and breathing like you have to do constantly, to where your garbage goes. And so it's all about creating a healthier society. So I'm sure you can already kind of see how that ties into my theme and my passion of community-driven solutions. Because when you're doing something that is so vital to every community and to life itself, you start to automatically kind of meld into that community research. So moving on to a little bit about my beginnings in engineering. So when I first went into engineering, I'm going to be totally honest, I wasn't even sure what engineering was. All I knew is that I was really good at math and science, and people that were important and close to me told me I would be a good engineer. And I also knew that I wanted to go to university. So my thoughts was I'd start in engineering, see how I liked it, and go from there. And I mean, I'm still around and I'm still doing engineering research, so obviously it worked out for me, but I'll take you kind of in the journey of how that worked. So the summer before I started engineering, you see here on my slide, I have a banner for DiscoverE. That is a program out of the University of Alberta that teaches STEAM camps to children like K to 12, and I got involved in being an instructor and helping in these camps. Again, based out of our campus. So since they were based out of campus, there was a lot of older students who were also working with this group. And through them, I got to meet a lot of advanced university students, and specifically a lot of women. There were a lot of women in engineering who were also passionate about teaching, who were around DiscoverE. So I got to start to meet people that were very inspiring to me and really gave me kind of a foothold of where I wanted to go. So that, even before I got into engineering, I had this wonderful support network of very strong, interesting, empowered women and people from all over the world. There was international students that worked with DiscoverE. So it really got me ready for what engineering would bring. I also have on the slide a picture of a big lecture hall. That lecture hall can seat 600 people. And I put that on there because coming to university, especially not exactly knowing what I was doing, was a little overwhelming, but mostly very exciting. And this lecture hall really represents that for me. It also represents another thing. In that classroom, we had Engineering 101, which is the introduction to the engineering profession, which I'll speak to a little bit later, but was very instrumental to me choosing environmental engineering. And then I also have a little picture of Amnesty International on here, because in my first year of engineering, I joined, I think, 7 different clubs that were all outside of my faculty, which is something I highly encourage because it really let me kind of understand, what the perspective was of other people who aren't in engineering, of engineers, which has kind of helped me temper how I need to relate and communicate with people that are outside of the profession. But it also gave me kind of another purpose because engineering is very closed off. We sometimes are very focused on, math, calculus, doing our calculations, getting a basic solution done easy. And sometimes we get kind of blinders on. And so being part of groups outside of the faculty kind of helped remind me what engineering is all about. It's about creating a better world. It's about problem solving to make the world more efficient and just work better for everyone. And it's hard to make the world work better for everyone if you are kind of closed off and aren't aware of what everyone else's problems are, if that kind of makes sense. And that's something that I made sure to do in my first year, was really branch out and kind of hear from other people. So as I kind of mentioned, a lot of inspiring women in STEAM were what really propelled my first couple years in engineering. So I had a couple of really cool professors that had a very unique voice and especially had gone through engineering earlier than me, obviously, and at a time where there's even less engineering or women in engineering. And I went to a lot of speaker series. I had a lot of cool, interesting peers from all over the world. And like I said, especially senior students that were around to help me out. But specifically, there was one professor in mind. So Professor Dr. Anya Ulrich, she is now the Associate Dean out of our faculty. So she's risen very high. She's the only female Associate Dean currently. And back when I started engineering, she was a professor in environmental engineering. So back to that Engineering 101 class in that big scary lecture hall, like I had just mentioned. So I'm sitting there one day, and they would have different professors to come in to kind of give you the elevator pitch on their discipline. Because at the end of the first year of engineering, you get to choose which discipline you go into. So they take turns coming in to kind of tell you a little bit about what you would be learning and how that would translate to the real world. And a lot of the presentations were very much, this is what you learn, these are the companies you can work for. When environmental engineering came around, it was a little bit different. So Dr. Ulrich, again, this very interesting, well-established woman, gets up to speak, and she shares a story about a case study that's very important to her. So I'll speak about this case study here on the next slide, but when she came in speaking, again, about engineering problems and very technical aspects, but with the human side and with the empathy and community-based solution, it was just something I'd never heard before, and I really didn't know what was out there, and she inspired me and ended up totally rejiggering and re-steering where I was planning to go, because at that point, I actually had already made my choice for discipline, and after her speech, I changed. So her speech was about a case study, arsenic poisoning in Bangladesh from wells. So for those of you who haven't heard of this case study, I'll just give a quick background. So back in, mostly in the 90s, there was a push for using underground water wells to get water, potable water for drinking in Bangladesh from outside non-governmental authorities such as UNICEF, as well as from inside in their own government, because there was a huge problem of bacterial contamination from surface water, which makes sense. So often underground water, because it is being filtered through the rock, it is a safer source of water. But the issue was, it just so happened that Bangladesh was over rocks that had a high concentration of arsenic, which can leach into the water. So, engineers go in, they come up with a perfectly fine solution for most scenarios. But specifically in this context, it actually did more worse than good, because now it started a whole new issue of arsenic poisoning, which was something I hadn't really dealt with before, and creates a lot more long-lasting human health effects. So my professor who was speaking this day, she comes up and she talks about this problem, she outlines it, and then she outlines how then to come up with a new solution, they had to work with the community, because, they've gone in and they've already given their solution and it didn't work. So not only did they have to come up with a context-sensitive solution to fix their original solution, but they also had to regain the trust of the community and find ways to repair the harm they've done, and explain and educate on signs of arsenic poisoning and how to deal with it, and that it's not contagious, because that was kind of a cultural misunderstanding at the time. So just showing how basic engineering problems also had components of, sociology and cultural learning and collaboration and interdisciplinary collaboration with educators and culturalists and all of these things to make a better solution, because sometimes just the engineering solution, like I said, can actually make things worse. So when she outlined this case study, she kind of just blew my mind. And then fast forward 3 years later, when I'm furthering along and now I'm in environmental engineering, we actually did this case study as a technical problem where we had to come up with our own solutions based on what we knew of the general case-specific scenarios. So this was a very formative case study and example for me in my life. So obviously that leads into the topic of my talk, so collaboration and diversity for innovation. So now I'd like to talk about one of my own personal experiences with this. So as one of my co-op work terms, I worked with Engage North. It is a program here at the University of Alberta that basically sends students, such as myself, to live on a First Nations reserve in Canada, up in northern Alberta, so getting very high up, kind of close to the territories and Alaska line. And I was a lands and consultation fellow. So what that meant is I was supposed to come in with my expertise and my knowledge and help them solve problems that I could help with. That sounds very vague, and it was. I didn't go into the internship having any projects in mind or knowing exactly what I'd work on. I went in to the band office on the reserve and I told them what my background was, what environmental engineering is, kind of what types of engineering solutions and math background that I could help with, and then I asked them how they thought that could apply. And I ended up doing a variety of very important, meaningful work for myself. So I ended up helping, they were choosing new land to expand the reserve on because of some historical oversights, let's say. So I was able to help them look at, kind of weigh the different risks and benefits of different land for things like petroleum extraction or for cultural significance or for agriculture, and just look at kind of the different strata underneath the earth and just all the different things they would be getting from a parcel of land. So that was applying my knowledge and my engineering in a very new and different way. I also helped do some surveying, do some work at their water treatment plant. But most of all, what I gained from this experience is just a new perspective on engineering solutions. So there is a bit of, especially in traditional kind of Western male-driven engineering, there is a bit of kind of an ego associated with solutions and with their designs. There's something about when you have a design, it fits all the basic criteria, it fits all the standards, that's it, that's the design, it's perfect. But oftentimes, when you make these designs in isolation and then you go and try and implement them in a community or in any sort of real-world setting, There's often things that you hadn't taken into account or you just didn't know. And there has been something in the past of engineers not being able to let go of their ego to say, you know what, you're right, I didn't think about that. That's new information for me. Let's redesign this together. But that is something that A needs to change, but B is changing. There is quite a different culture that's emerging, especially I've noticed in my faculty, but in general in research and in online communities, there is quite this shift from having a one-size-fit-all solution to working with communities to make actually innovative and efficient designs. And that is something I got to kind of see the effects of firsthand when you don't do that. For example, it is very common practice to add chlorine to water because chlorine kills bacteria, but there is a very deeply held and rooted sentiment in certain First Nations communities that water is life and you don't want to be killing it and hitting it with chlorine. And that's not to say that then, oh, we're all wrong and we should stop putting chlorine in water ever, but when you're making a wastewater treat or a water treatment facility for that community, there are other options. You don't need to shock it with chlorine. And now being put with that problem, it's actually the perfect engineering scenario because you get to do the fun problem-solving bit of finding a new way to have the same quality without that chlorine. Not saying that that's always right, but it's just something to keep in mind because then if you put in this system that has all this chlorine and people aren't using it, what's the point? So moving on a little bit, me and one of my friends from the Engage North program, who's also in engineering, she works with the Faculty of Engineering now, her and I have started a Women's Society group for women in advanced studies at the University of Alberta, so in research. And as her and I have gone through this journey of finding interesting women in research and in high faculty positions, it has just been so inspiring to have these women around and hear their stories, hear what they're working on. And oftentimes there's a lot of, we're all doing different things, but there's a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration. Like my friend Tori that I started this group with, she's a mining engineer, but the other day she read an interesting paper about air quality from in around mining communities affecting education performance levels, and she shared it with me. So having these interesting women around you is always a great thing, and I put this quote on there because it's kind of one of the founding principles our group is based on, that if you look at the people in your circle and you don't get inspired, then you don't have a circle, you have a cage. That's something I've really had to work on in my engineering journey, is just finding those people that inspire me and that empower me and making sure I surround myself with them and making sure I don't get into my own kind of group where I'm working on my own and I'm forgetting that having these interesting, empowering women around actually elevates my day and my learning and my education. Something Tori and I noticed the other day, we were around at a presentation on First Nations engagement in engineering, and we looked around and I think 90% of the people there were women, and we got to talking about it. And you know, oftentimes in these areas that are more interdisciplinary and require kind of more emotional intelligence and other traits that haven't always been valued in engineering, you see a lot of women stepping into these spaces and driving change, which is so inspiring and so cool to see and gives me a lot of hope for the future. So kind of with that idea, I have here on my slide, kind of as a conclusion, just something to get you thinking. These are the emerging skills list from the 2020 jobs report from the World Economic Forum. So you see a lot of so in the 2020 line, those are the emerging skills. In 2015 are the past emerging skills. So you can see there's a lot of things like emotional intelligence and creativity and coordination that are increasing as skills, because as we move to more of these community-based and group-based and interdisciplinary solutions, you need to be able to empathize with people that are coming from a very different either worldview or even just scientific background than you, and understand that they're bringing something very important and unique to the table. So the ability to do that is something that is on the rise, while things that are more basic, like, you know, judgment making and just hard skills are decreasing. Something I noticed and thought about when I was graduating from my undergrad is I looked around at, the 900 people that were graduating and realized they all understand calculus. They all understand the same basic science and math principles as I do. We all have those hard skills. But what really sets apart the change makers is having kind of that vision and that motivation and that emotional intelligence and wanting to make a change. And that's where I think, having the diverse perspectives and having kind of that female perspective that's often been lacking is really going to kind of change the world as we know it. So that is my formal presentation. I think I got almost exactly half an hour. So now we'll move on to questions.
So thank you so much for kind of sharing all of that. That was fantastic. So for our attendees, if you have questions, feel free to just type them in the chat box and we will answer them. And so as people are kind of typing their questions in, I did want to start off with a question that I had as you were talking about kind of your experience working with First Nation communities, like designing like water treatment facilities and kind of just working with them in engineering. I guess what were some of the greatest challenges that kind of came up as you worked in those communities, and how did you overcome them?
Absolutely. Well, one of the big things that I kind of struggled with is I was coming in with a kind of Western business-centric perspective. That's, I've grown up in a large city, and especially in engineering, we're very driven to have results, get projects done, get them on budget, get them on time. And that is just a perspective that isn't really held by First Nations. They have a very much more relaxed sense of time. Well, I'm someone who shows up places 15 minutes early. They would often be half an hour late to work, and no one cares because they have I even had an elder explain it to me that they have a perspective that time is your own, and if you slept in, you needed that sleep. If you got stuck talking to somebody, that was an important conversation. And so just challenging my own perspective of that, and especially in the, more technical aspects when we were trying to get a project done and people were, putting things off because of something else. And I had to kind of check myself and remind myself that I was working for them, and the best way to do that was to do it their way. And even if that meant, in my mind, being, behind schedule. And so, it was a lot of just kind of challenging my perspectives. That was difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important just to do in general. We did have a question that came in from someone about what does AWARE stand for?
Okay, let me pull it up on my phone. I'm the one who came up with the acronym, so I should really remember, but it's kind of long. But I do have it here. Association of Worldly, Active, Remarkable, and Empowered Women. Or Women of STEM is then the continuation.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, we just thought we wanted something fun, and we wanted to really kind of challenge our awareness of the world around us and to be more, again, aware of the different research and the different work that women were doing at our university. So that's kind of why we went that way. We just thought it was fun.
Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if anyone does have more questions, feel free to type it in. I guess we can end with one last question, which is just what advice would you give to yourself, like if you could go back and meet like your middle school or high school self?
I probably one of the biggest advice I would give is balance. And I mean that in all sense of the terms. It's something that I think I've not necessarily mastered, but I've definitely got a better handle on now. But I think it's important to kind of balance your interest in school. I think it's important to, if you love math, like obviously you do your math and you like it and prioritize it, but also make a point of, realizing that social sciences and English and all of that all balances and is all important in basically any profession you go into. You're going to have to write, you're going to have to communicate, you're going to have to understand the significance of what you're doing. So I think just kind of finding that balance both academically but personally, making time for yourself and for, being healthy, getting active, making friends, but also, whatever you're passionate for. So just making sure you make time for things you're passionate for, and you kind of try and balance yourself out. When I was little, I loved sports. I played a lot of hockey, but I do think, also being someone who liked to read and liked kind of those nerdy things, I did let those maybe slip a little because they weren't as cool as the sports. So just, making time for everything you're interested in. Not pigeonholing yourself, I guess, is what I mean.
That's fantastic advice. On that note, thank you so much, Emily, for just being here today on the field trip and for sharing with us your story and all this fantastic advice.
No problem. It was tons of fun. I'm really glad I got to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
No problem. Have a good day.
You too.